Hello and welcome to this podcast on the course of the American Civil War. The first topic is that of the home front and the consequence of it. In many ways, the Civil War was won not on the battlefields, but rather behind the lines at home. At the start of the war, it looked like the Union had all the overwhelming advantages. Firstly, it had almost all of the country's industry. For every factory worker in the South, there was an entire factory in the North. The North had 97% of small arms production, 98% of clothing and textile production, 100% of cannon production, 99% of ship production, over 80% of coal production, over 90% of iron production. The North was also growing its industry, while what little industry there was in the South was getting smaller and smaller. While the South did develop domestic industry during the war, it was limited in scope and scale, and was unable to fully supply the Confederate forces with enough of virtually anything, from bullets to boots to bandages. The North also had the vast majority of railroad miles in pre-war America. Railroads would become a vital part of the Civil War, as they would allow men and material to be moved to the front quickly and efficiently, something that would become very important during it. Not only did the South have a very small railroad network, it also had structural problems with the railroads. Rather than having a large integrated rail system like the North had, it had a system where railroads seemed to exist only to get cotton from major regional centres, like Atlanta or Montgomery, to port. This meant the railroads were unconnected between towns inland, and thus largely useless for the job of moving men and supplies to the front. Another structural problem with the Confederate rail system was the lack of a uniform rail gauge. There were three main gauges in the Confederacy. First was the wide gauge that was fairly uniform across most of the Deep South, though changed into narrow gauges in places depending on the company laying the track. North Carolina and Virginia used Stevenson Standard, which is a narrow gauge track also used by the United States. And the final main gauge was another wide gauge that covered most of Louisiana and Tennessee. In addition to these three major ones, there were dozens of smaller, almost unique gauges blanketing the South. This meant that the South's shortage of locomotives was made worse by the fact that locomotives they did have could only run on the gauge they were built for, and men and supplies would have to be switched from trains if the gauge switched at all, which it often did. The South also had a shortage of trained railroad engineers to maintain what railroads it did have. The Confederate government was not helpful on this front either. Any attempts to get the government to try and expand the rail system was either met with apathy or outright hostility for much of the war. It was only in the last 2 years of the war, starting in 1863, when the government tried to actually expand the rail network, and out of only 3 planned expansions, only 1 was ever built. In terms of naval strength, another key area of the war, the Union was also overwhelmingly strong. The South had only 2 major ports, those of New Orleans and Richmond, and no shipyards capable of building major ships in either sea. This meant that the South had no choice but to use its already limited capital to buy its ships off neutral powers like Britain and France. In addition, while large parts of the army joined the Confederacy at the start of the war, virtually none of the U.S. Navy followed suit. Lack of a navy left the Confederate states vulnerable to one of the Union tactics, which was to try and blockade the Confederacy and cut it off from supplies from Europe, a major place where they're getting much of their arms and other equipment from. While in the start of the war, this blockade was highly porous and ineffective, by 1862 and 1863, it started to become crippling for the South. The cotton that the Confederacy was planting, more out of habit than any real economic reason, lacked a destination either in the North or in Europe, and piled up in warehouses. The land used for growing cotton wasn't used for growing actual foodstuff, like wheat, much of which the South had imported from the North in pre-war years. What little wheat there was being confiscated for use by the army. This led to chronic bread and general food shortages in the South, which would cause bread riots in almost all major southern cities. These riots were eventually put down by soldiers, but it further disrupted the war effort. The South wasn't entirely without points in its favour, however. The South was naturally defensible, especially in the critical regions of northern Virginia, where in between Washington, D.C. and Richmond were a string of rivers which would prove critical in Confederate defense. They also had an extremely long coastline, which, while lacking major ports, had many smaller ports, thus making it extremely hard to blockade. In addition, it had few accesses to the deep south through the west, the Appalachian Mountains forming a natural barrier for Union troops moving into Georgia. The final main point I had in its favour was the Mississippi River Valley, a highly fertile area around the Mississippi River that the Confederacy controlled. It did have some problems with terrain. This coastline that was hard to blockade was also hard to defend, especially by the already overstretched Confederate Navy, and thus several key victories from the Union, like the Battle of New Orleans, happened through what were essentially amphibious landings that the Confederacy had little to no defense against. South also had better generalship than the Union, not only having many of its top officers defect to them at the start of the war, but the South also contained 5 of the nation's 6 military colleges, including all of the Army colleges. South also had the advantage of fighting defensively on their own terms. And in this period, due to, as the war would show, the defender was heavily favoured. As Napoleon once said, God fights on the side with the biggest battalions, and the American Civil War was no different in this respect. While the South did have better leaders and terrain, they were nowhere near matching the North in either industrial capability or manpower. Even from the start of the war, it was obvious, seeing the strength of the two nations, there was a matter of when, not if, the South was going to fall. Thanks for listening to this episode of my podcast. I'll have more on this topic and others in weeks to come. Bye. Okay, that's Mark 1.